Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to demonstrate about how we can pull the Zendesk user data into ServiceNow instance. So as part of this implementation I'm going to demonstrate number one, how we can test this out in Postman. Number two, how we can actually implement this within our ServiceNow instance. So the implementation within ServiceNow instance is nothing more than just dealing with the JSON data and being able to access the Zendesk instance. So let's see how it goes in the Postman. So this is my API URL. So the whole URL would be something like companyname.zendesk.com/API version2 users.json. This is the API URL to be able to pull the user information via API calls from Zendesk. And then I'm using my Zendesk admin credentials to be pull that information from Zendesk. And once I click on send, so I received some data in the response. And also when I talk about the URL would look something like this. Let's say the company name is Google. That's it. And now since I've copied the response, so the response is more of a user object with an array, and towards the end of the object there is an option called next page. So if let's say the total user count which is present in your Zendesk instance is huge, let's say 20,000, 40,000, 50,000, 60,000. So once you plan to pull the data will be available in the form of pages. So you should be able to pull the data not in just one instance of your API call, but in multiple instances. Now you cannot sit and keep observing the data pull and trigger it again and again by changing the URL. So you need to make your script in such a way that once you have pulled the data for the first page, it automatically goes to the next page and tries to pull data from your second page until and unless there is no data, there is no next page. So this is the variable which we can use, next underscore page, within the response, which helps us to know whether more data exists or not. So in the end, when all the pages are being read and there is no other page with user data, this would come up as null. So this is pretty much it about how we can pull this information from Zendesk. Now let's see how we can utilize these scripts, these responses uh, to be able to pull the information within our ServiceNow instance. Now let me give you an overall overview of, at a high level though, how this can be configured in ServiceNow. So first of all, I'm going to create a REST message. Let's give it a generic name, Zendesk import, because I'm going to add methods after that. Company.zendesk.com. Then I can let's say give no authentication for now. I'm going to save this REST message, and I'm going to add HTTP method, import users. It's going to be a get call, and if I'm going to pass the endpoint directly to the script, then no matter what I give here doesn't matter. But still, let's give company.zendesk.com, and I am going to add a header for authorization. Since I'm using basic auth, I just don't want to pass the credentials directly. So I'm going to pass the credentials from here. These are the same credentials which I've entered before. Once we run our request in Postman, it converts it to this particular format. So now let's save it. And that's it. So now I am going to create a script include to include all my scripts, the function calls and everything. And I'm going to create a scheduled job which is going to trigger the pull. What else? Let me think. So let's create a scheduled job. Automatically run a script. Zendesk users import is the name, and on demand. Come on, where's the script part? Where is the script part? Then let's see, endpoint. I'm going to store the endpoint in a system property. So then I'm going to pass the name of the system property over here. For example, this is the name of my system property where I am saving the endpoint URL. And when I say the endpoint URL, the URL is same as this one, which is the complete endpoint, company name.zendesk.com/API v2users.json. Okay. Now I am going to have a script include call. So let's create the script include here. And okay, let's save it. And then I'm going to call a function. Let's assume the name of my function is get user data. Okay, let's copy this and complete our script include. I'm going to pass the endpoint over here. Save it. So my scheduled job is ready to pull the data, but my logic is not. So I'm going to write my logic within this script include, and I'm going to explain you. Do not worry about it. So how am I going to pass that JSON object and everything, and how I'm going to save my data? So within this, first thing that I need to do is use a try and catch block, which is very important no matter what kind of script you are writing within ServiceNow instance, so that if there's an error, you are not just left high and dry. Okay, you will be able to find it in the logs. So let's give it a name. Now within this try and catch block, first line would be the REST message call. Dot, come on, doesn't give me options for some reason. I think this is the function name, and then I'm going to pass the name of my REST message over here. And then the method name. Okay, so now I need to set the endpoint. So there is a method named set endpoint. It's crazy how ServiceNow doesn't give any recommendations here. So where's my endpoint? I think I'm passing it from here into this function call, so it should be available. So I'm going to pass my endpoint within this. Now since I've passed it, I need to store a response and execute this REST message. Now whatever response is returned will be stored in the RESP variable. You can also call it a response so that you guys are not confused. And I can also fetch a response body from this response by using response.body. Okay, next part would be if you want to check the status code, whether it was a success or not, whether it is 200 or 400, something like that. That can also be stored within a variable called http status and that you can get from get status code is the name of the function. Now I think my REST message is executed and the response is available to me in the response and response body. So I just need to pass that response body, okay, so that I can access the variables as an object. Otherwise it would be available as a string and I cannot dot fork it. So let's declare a variable JSON response user, and I am going to do a JSON dot pass response body. Fine. Now this response, which is available in the JSON format, I can use to loop through the data, because as I mentioned earlier, the data is available to me in the form of an object, and within that object there exists an array, and within that array there are multiple objects, and within each object is user data present for each of the users. So I need to be able to access using dot walking, applying a loop, and then again dot walking. We'll walk through it, don't worry. So I don't want to write any additional logic within the same function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call another function named save user data, and I will pass my JSON response. Within that function call. First, let's save whatever we have done so far. And I will create another function call. And within this function call, I'm going to loop through my data and things like that, saving the user data and everything. Okay. Now let's talk more about the response body. So the data returned here looks something like this, where I have an object. Okay. Within this object, there are a few variables and an array. The array name is users, and then within that array there are multiple objects, like this is the first object, then this is the second object, and each object refers to a user in the database. which means if there are two objects here, there are two users in the database. Okay, now we are going to pass through this JSON object and save the user data. So first thing that I want to do is I want to access this users array. Okay, now let's use the same thing that we did earlier. I'm going to add a try catch block. I can simply print this using, okay, and within this try catch block I'm going to pass through the user data. So let's declare a variable called user response, and I'm going to access the users array. So within the user response variable, an array is stored, and I can also store the next page URL. Which can be accessed via JSON response user dot next underscore page. Since this is not inside array, the array closes here, this can be directly accessed. Okay, so here I have my next page URL as well. Okay, now if we need to make sure that user response is an array, not an object as well, right? Let's say there's only one user, and the way, not only Zendesk, let's talk about all the applications available in the world in the most generic way. Uh, let's assume there is only one user present. Zendesk might return it as an array or as an object. Okay, or Zendesk might maintain their code designed in a way that no matter whether it is one object present or multiple, it is always an array. And I've seen several tools where if there are multiple objects present, then it returns an array. If there's only one object present, then it returns it in the form of an object only. So we can have an additional check in that case to make sure that we are passing through the array, and that can be done via instance of user response instance of array. So if we are receiving an array, then only the script will enter within this if condition. Otherwise it will go to the else and run it accordingly. So within this, now since I know that this is an array, I will run a loop which will run up till the length of the array, and I'm going to do a count plus plus. Now within this loop I have access to each of the users object one by one. Okay, so what can be done now? Then instead of writing the whole logic here, what I can do is I can call another function to save my data. And within this I am going to pass each object which can be accessed via this script. So let's save our code one more time. Now since we have made this function call over here, we need to add a definition to this function, and I'm going to add it right away. So this is the function which makes sure that data is inserted in the database no matter what table you want to store this data in. For example, if you want to store this in a user table, sys underscore user table would be the place where the data has to be stored. And if you want to store this data, let's say as part of your customer service management implementation, because Zendesk is mostly used for customers or partners, and if you're planning to replace Zendesk with ServiceNow and have your customer service management implementation and replacing and everything that was there in Zendesk with everything in ServiceNow. Then you need to bring all the data from Zendesk into ServiceNow. Then your main user table would be contact table, customer underscore contact table. In that case, you will be storing your data in customer underscore contact table. But my recommendation here is do not store data directly in sys underscore user table or customer underscore contact table. Always use an import set. For that purpose, you need to create a table which extends import set row, and as part of insert user data logic, you need to insert your data into that import set table. So the logic would be simply like user import equals to new live record. Here I need to give the import set table name, and then I need to initialize, then script to set fields, and then dot insert. Okay, so when we talk about imports, you need to create a transform map. So for example, you want to save your data finally into, let's say, customer underscore contact table. Then you need to create a transform map to transform the records from this import set table name to your actual user table, whether it's sys underscore user or customer underscore contact for CSM. Now this script would work fine for all the data that is coming from Zendesk, as long as all the data is present in a single page. Now what if the data is present in multiple pages, and as mentioned earlier, next page is not null, which means there are more pages to import the user data from. So in that case, what we are going to do is, first of all, I added an if condition to check whether this is an array or just an object. If it is an object, then add an else condition, else block, and within that else block I'm going to call this function again, but this time I'm going to pass only the user response. What if this is not an array but an object? Okay, so I'm going to pass that object directly to insert user data, and it would work fine. Now we were talking about how we are going to make sure that all the script runs in a loop and we don't have to trigger the next page endpoint every single time manually by updating the endpoint. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another condition to make sure that my script runs in a loop for all the pages at a single time. So within this function call where I'm saving the user data, I am saving the next page URL. After this part of the script, I'm going to add a condition that if user's next page URL is not nil, then I am going to do a recursive call to my get user data function, and I need to pass the endpoint here. But where am I storing the endpoint? My endpoint is stored in this variable itself. So now how this is going to behave? This is my schedule job. I triggered my schedule job. Then this function is called. It calls the REST message, gets the response, if authentication is successful. I'm saving this response. If there are multiple users, it enters within this. If not, it will call this function directly. It sends the user object one by one into this function as long as the loop runs. Once the loop is finished, it will come here and it will check whether next page URL was empty or not. If it was empty, it will not enter this if condition and the execution will end. If it was not empty, if it was empty, then it will not run further and the execution will end. And if it is not empty, then it will again call this function get user data and all the process would rerun again. So this is pretty much it about pulling the user data from Zendesk into ServiceNow and how do we pass the JSON response that we have received from Zendesk. Thank you so much for watching.